Hello and welcome. I'm Fahd. Islamabad is buzzing tonight, not just with activity, not just with protocol, but with anticipation of something far bigger. Because in the next few hours, this city will host what may well be the most consequential peace talks of our lifetimes. Delegations from the United States and Iran are arriving here, led by some of the most senior figures in their respective governments. And for the first time, in weeks of relentless escalation, there is at least a possibility, not a guarantee, but a possibility that the trajectory of this conflict could possibly change. And if that possibility exists today, which it does, it exists because Pakistan has delivered. Now, let's not understate this. These talks did not emerge out of thin air. They are the result of sustained, patient, and at times extremely difficult diplomacy. Pakistan has leveraged its relationships with Washington, with Tehran, with regional capitals to bring two deeply entrenched adversaries to the same table. In a conflict which is defined by mistrust, miscalculation, and mounting violence, getting to this point is itself a significant achievement. But even as Islamabad prepares to host these talks, the reality outside this room is far from reassuring. In fact, it is deeply troubling. Because the ceasefire that created this opening is already under strain. And the reason is not difficult to identify. Israel. In the past 24 hours alone, Israeli strikes on Lebanon have killed hundreds of civilians and injured many more. Entire neighborhoods have been reduced to rubble. Hospitals are overwhelmed, families are mourning, and this is happening at a moment when the world is trying desperately to step back from the brink. Now, here is where the situation becomes more complicated. Let me explain. This is the map of Lebanon, and what you're seeing right here, this is the border with Israel, and this red area that you are seeing is the Lebanese territory which has been illegally invaded and occupied by Israel. Now, this is the Litani River, strategic river which divides North Lebanon from South Lebanon. If you remember, in 2006, in the big Lebanese Hezbollah and Israel war, this was where the Israelis were also bombing and trying to cut off south from the north. This is exactly what they're trying to do once again. And only in the last few days, they have stepped up their attacks on Lebanon. Now, these cities are the ones that have been targeted by Israel. And as you can see, from the south all the way to the north, to Beirut, where Israeli planes are targeting indiscriminate firing and attacks and killing and murder of innocent people of Lebanon. 1,700 civilians in Lebanon have been killed since March 2006, and at least 254 civilians were killed only in one day yesterday. So this is after the ceasefire was announced. This shows you exactly how Israel is trying to play the spoiler. In return, in retaliation, Hezbollah is taking the attacks back to Israel as it should in self-defense. And these are the areas including Haifa, which is a very strategic port of Israel, where Hezbollah have targeted. Mind you, please keep this in mind, that Hezbollah is targeting military installations, military targets, whereas Israel, as we've seen, has resorted to what it has been doing in Gaza, which is absolute targeting of civilians. Now, based on all of this, as you can see, that Lebanon has become the center of dispute even as we come very close to the ceasefire agreement. The original post by Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, which came yesterday, mentioned very clearly, as you can see, where he says that the Islamic Republic of Iran and the US of America, along with the allies, have agreed to an immediate ceasefire everywhere, including Lebanon. So this was the key point, and obviously because this post, this announcement, we can safely assume had the concurrence of all concerned, including the US, clearly something changed afterwards. Now, if you look at what happened later on, you can also now see that as a follow-up, the Prime Minister issued this post which says, violations of ceasefire have been reported at few places across the conflict zone which undermine the spirit of peace process. I earnestly and sincerely urge all parties to exercise restraint. So the very fact that the Prime Minister of Pakistan has had to publicly acknowledge that these violations of ceasefire can actually put this entire effort into danger means that it is a serious issue. And as I said earlier, there is absolutely zero doubt that the country responsible for this, being the spoiler that it is Israel. Which is why when this statement came today from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Pakistan, it reinforced what the Prime Minister had said. The statement says, Pakistan condemns in the strongest terms the ongoing Israeli aggression against Lebanon, resulting in the loss of innocent lives and the widespread destruction of infrastructure. Then the statement says, the Israeli actions undermine international efforts to establish peace and stability in the region and constitute a blatant violation of international law and fundamental humanitarian principles. So clearly Pakistan is now stepping up pressure on clearly Israel, of course, but more importantly, urging the United States, if you read between the lines, to make sure that Israel is reined in from playing the spoiler with its aggression on against Lebanon. That is the major flashing red light right now, because as you can see, Pakistan is not the only country who's been constantly referring to this problem. This is the post from the speaker of the Iranian parliament, who is possibly going to be one of the negotiators, and he also says very clearly that Lebanon and the entire axis as Iran's allies form an inseparable part of the ceasefire. PM Shehbaz Sharif publicly and clearly stressed that the Lebanon issue, there is no room for denial and backtracking. So again, it shows clearly how the position of Pakistan and Iran is now in many ways similar, pointing towards Lebanon and Israeli aggression as the major problem. And the whole world actually agrees with what we are saying, because it is clear as day. Everyone knows the role, the dirty role that Israel is playing, which is why you see the French president saying that he expressed full solidarity in the face of indiscriminate strikes carried out by Israel in Lebanon today. And then he says they pose a direct threat to the sustainability of the ceasefire. He's absolutely correct. And then, of course, if you look at the European Council statement, it also very clearly says that we call upon all sides to implement ceasefire, including Lebanon. There is a consensus which is building that Israel must stop. But then, as we have seen in the past, the only country that can actually rein in Israel is the United States, which is where the weekend talks become very important. Now, clearly, there is a fundamental disagreement over what this ceasefire actually means. Pakistan, as we've been talking about earlier, which brokered the deal along with Iran, maintains that the ceasefire applies across the region, including Lebanon, as I just mentioned to you and showed you the tweets of the Prime Minister. But the US and Israel have now taken a different position, arguing that the operations in Lebanon are not covered under the agreement, which, as we just argued, clearly is not what was agreed upon, apparently.
Lebanon is not part of the ceasefire. That has been relayed to all parties involved in the ceasefire.
I think the Iranians thought that the ceasefire included Lebanon, and it just didn't. We never made that promise. We never indicated that was going to be the case. What we said is that the ceasefire would be focused on Iran, and the ceasefire would be focused on America's allies, both Israel and the Gulf Arab states.
This disagreement is not just technical, it is actually very dangerous. Why do I say that? Because it strikes at the very heart of the diplomatic process. If one party believes the ceasefire is comprehensive and the other believes it is selective, then what you have is not a ceasefire. You have a pause with conditions, and pauses like that rarely hold. And it also gets worse because Israel is not just spoiling the peace, it is one of the principal reasons for this war actually happened. A detailed account of this reveals that Israeli leadership presented this war to Washington as something which would be quick and sharp and decisive. They argued that Iran's capability could be significantly degraded within weeks, that retaliation risks were manageable, and that escalation would remain contained. Basically, in other words, the war was presented as limited, controlled, and achievable. The story that I'm referring to has been published in the New York Times, and it clearly says that Mr. Netanyahu and his team outlined conditions they portrayed as pointing to near certain victory. Iran's ballistic missile program could be destroyed in a few weeks, they argued. The regime would be so weakened that it could not choke off the Strait of Hormuz, and the likelihood that Iran would land blows against the US interest in the neighboring countries was assessed as minimal. So now, if you look at all this, you know clearly how flawed that assessment was, and we are now suffering because of that. Now, the Strait of Hormuz, of course, became the center of the crisis. Iran proved resilient. Retaliation spread across the region, and instead of a short campaign that they were thinking, the world is now dealing with a prolonged and destabilizing conflict. Now, even within the American system, there were serious reservations. Senior officials had cautioned, as published in the story, against overly ambitious objectives, particularly around regime change, warning that such expectations were unrealistic and they were not grounded in operational reality. So let's be very clear. This war was not just fought, it was sold. Sold is quick, sold is decisive, sold is manageable. And today, those claims stand horribly exposed. Which is precisely why Israel is now escalating again, because escalation delays accountability. And that is why Israel has become the biggest spoiler for peace. Now let me pause here for a moment, because there are times when analysis is not enough. There are times when you have to call things by their name. What we are witnessing first in Gaza and now again in Lebanon, it's not collateral damage. It is a pattern of overwhelming force used again and again against people who simply cannot defend themselves. We saw it in Gaza. Entire neighborhoods flattened, hospitals hit, families wiped out, and the world watched, debated, and issued statements. And now we are seeing it again in Lebanon. More civilians dead, more homes destroyed, more lives shattered. And we are told this is necessary. For what? For security? For deterrence? Or simply because no one has been able to stop it? Because let's be honest, if any other country did what Israel has done in Gaza and is now doing in Lebanon, it would be called exactly what it is: state terror. But when it comes to Israel, the language changes, the standards shift, and the accountability disappears. That is the problem. Because a country that believes it can act without consequence, that country eventually stops caring about consequences. And that is when it becomes dangerous, not just for its neighbors, but for the entire region and the entire world. Because you cannot build peace while one actor believes it is above the rules. You can't have stability when bombs are used as policy, as Israel does. And you cannot expect dialogue to succeed if at the same time cities are being reduced to rubble, as Israel is doing. So yes, this has to be said. Israel today is not just part of the conflict. It is the biggest obstacle to peace. Now look at the broader picture. Inside the US, this war is deeply unpopular. There are divisions, political fractures, and growing questions about cost and purpose. Markets are reacting. Again, oil rising, equities falling as uncertainty spreads. Now here, right here you can see, this is before the ceasefire. You can see how high the oil prices were. This is when the ceasefire is announced. Thanks to Pakistan, oil prices sharply go down. And then the last 24 hours or so, they kind of stayed at a stage, and now this, what you see, they're slightly rising. This is the markets being nervous. Nervous because of who? Because of Israel. Because Israel is not agreeing to the rules that have been agreed by the US and of course by other countries. This is what uncertainty does. At the same time, tensions in the Strait of Hormuz continue to disrupt global trade and energy flows, creating ripple effects across economies worldwide. All of this reinforces a very simple reality. There is no military solution here. Not for the US, not for Israel, not for anyone else involved. After weeks of conflict, the objectives that were initially outlined, they haven't really materialized. Iran remains defiant, the region remains unstable, and the costs continue to rise. Which brings us to a very simple but rather uncomfortable truth. The only way forward is diplomacy. There is no alternative. And that is why Islamabad is not just hosting talks, it is hosting the last viable pathway to de-escalation and peace. Because right now, this city, right here, it represents something very rare in this conflict. A space where both sides are willing to show up. A space where dialogue is still possible. And a space where outcomes, however difficult, they can be negotiated. But for that process to succeed, one thing must happen. The escalation must stop. And that means Israel must be restrained. Because no negotiation can survive under the shadow of ongoing bombardment. No agreement can be built while civilians are being massacred. And no peace process can move forward if one party continues to escalate. This is where the US faces its most important test. Because it cannot support diplomacy in Islamabad and allow escalation elsewhere. At some point, a choice has to be made. And that choice will determine whether these talks succeed or fail. Because failure is not theoretical. Failure means renewed escalation. Failure means deeper instability. And failure spreads across borders, across markets, across societies. That is why the world is watching Islamabad tonight. Not with certainty, but with hope. Because despite everything, there is still a chance. A fragile chance, but a real one. And that chance exists because Pakistan stepped forward when others hesitated. It stayed engaged when others disengaged. And it created a platform when none existed. That in itself is a remarkable achievement. Now the question is whether the parties involved can rise to the moment, because the opportunity is here, the platform is here, the world is watching, and the cost of failure is just too high.